Political borders in Europe are usually thought of as lines on a map, separating one political entity from another. However, there are many borderlands and border zones where belonging is ambiguous, arbitrary, or unstable. Throughout history, European borders shifted repeatedly, and what borders mean and how they are represented also changed over time. For any human community, physical and man-made barriers and symbolic cultural markers are important for delineating the territories in which they live and for establishing a community of belonging. The question of borders and frontiers is also strongly connected to the question of identity. In this video lecture, we will be exploring the history of borders in Europe from the early modern to the contemporary era across two main dimensions. On the one hand, we will be looking at how European borders changed over time, and on the other hand, we will be analyzing what they meant at different times. Chronologically, we will look at borders across three main periods: the early modern period, we will also look at borders in modern history, and we will look at borders in contemporary history. Before beginning, though, there are three key terms that are going to be quite crucial for us. First, the notion of borders, namely also understood as dividing lines. Frontiers, intended as outer lines of expansion. And mental maps, namely the ways in which physical space is imagined and represented within a given society, and how this can be a tool for cultural orientation and for the self-identification of its members. We could think of Europe in the early modern period as composed of a variety of civil and ecclesiastical borders. In the early modern period, political borders were often marked by natural barriers. There were no comprehensive system of control posts, and to protect their border region against invasions, some early modern states, such as the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania, established a system of smaller camps and larger castles. Vassals used toll roads, mountain passes, and narrow points on rivers, as well as town walls as checkpoints to collect tolls and customs. In the early modern times, political entities could shift their boundaries in a variety of ways, among them war, inheritance, or exchange. The early modern period was also an important phase in the development of cartography, namely the art and science of graphically representing a geographical area on a map or a chart. But it is important to keep in mind that cartography was not an autonomous intellectual discipline. Instead, it usually reflected the power aspirations of its patrons, particularly the rulers that invested in it. Enlightenment thinkers and rulers aimed to influence statecraft by employing surveyors and other experts to identify resources and to establish an efficient basis for tax assessment. It is also crucial to know that maps often suggest homogeneity within a given area and also sharp distinctions between different areas. Looking at the political maps of the period can often lead one to overlook just how blurry boundaries were still in practice. The signing of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, marked the emergence of the early modern state, as well as the division of Europe along confessional lines. It also changed the nature of borders. It increased the need for authoritative lines of demarcation. In many instances, the monopoly of power in the hands of a single sovereign replaced the power relations of the medieval feudal hierarchy. Holding rights of jurisdiction over a community of subjects separated areas under the sovereign rule from those where these rights did not apply. Then, in the 18th century, the concept of sovereignty underwent major changes. A growing national consciousness on the part of state subjects was paralleled by the growing power and ambition of the rulers, who made use of professional armies and military equipment. These were all steps in the direction of making the so-called nation-state, a political entity defined within clear borders. Borders were really central to the process of defining a given nation vis-à-vis the neighbors. These new national borders gradually superseded the confessional ones. By the 18th century, several European states consisted of territories with different religions and confessions. This process signified an important step towards the unification of states with long-lasting effects for the 19th and 20th centuries. At the same time, with the imposition of these unified borders came the imposition of cultural borders, a process which often involved the standardization of languages and the homogenization of cultures. Borders in the modern sense, namely borders conceived of as a fusion of political, taxation and customs jurisdictions, began developing during the 19th century. At the start of the modern era, a variety of physical borders were still to be found across Europe, but also interior borderlands, the great swathes of territory that bounded the European continental empires and where they clashed with one another. These remained fluid zones with ebbing and flowing lines of political domination, resulting in a huge buildup of tension and friction that, as we will see, spilled over into the 20th century. The fluid borders gradually transformed during the 19th century into more definitive frontier lines. The dynastic principle of domination, meanwhile, became gradually replaced with a geopolitical one, in which territorial units became more important than dynastic connections. Loyalty to a state, to a defined land or territory, and eventually to the nation, superseded the allegiance to a monarch. In geopolitical terms, the map of Europe changed drastically following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, as well as the Congress of Vienna, when new states and new borders emerged and disappeared within the span of a few years. Napoleon Bonaparte changed and abolished borders, for example those of the Holy Roman Empire, and by doing so, he set in motion political and social developments across the continent that would lead European peoples to reconsider their identity, their interests, and also their rights and laws. In the 19th century, a wave of nationalism spread across Europe. After the Napoleonic Wars, ideals of national unity, collective identity, such as people sharing the same language, culture, history, started to play an increasingly important role. And this is what Benedict Anderson meant when he wrote about the emergence of imagined communities. The leaders of nationalist movements in Europe strengthened the idea of a national community with the feeling of belonging to a territorial homeland delineated by clear borders. Lines on the map became a symbol of collective identity. These clear-cut border lines also helped citizens to define who their compatriots were and who they were not. This us versus them dichotomy was very much based on the existence of clear borders between states, regions, and other administrative units. They created a sense of identity and cohesion. However, many ethnic, national, and religious minorities existed in Europe and were scattered across several countries. Such ethnic enclaves were often seen as subversive of efforts to construct nationally homogeneous states. With the rise of nationalism, some also became targets of forced assimilation, such as the Sami and the Quen peoples in the process of the so-called Norwegianization. With the spread of nationalism and the notion that state borders should correspond with ethnic boundaries, the scene was also set for irredentism, namely for territorial claims based on national, ethnic, or other bases. During the 19th century, micro-borders disappeared and were replaced by two sizable territorial units, the German Empire and the Kingdom of Italy, as well as several small and medium-sized states, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. The western half of the continent, by contrast, remained reliably compact from a territorial perspective, and the Habsburg and Tsarist empires remained firmly in control of their territories, and they even increased their possessions marginally. In Western Europe, modern nation-states were emerging, while more traditional empires survived in the East, a dynamic that produced its own territorial shifts. The exception to this rule of territorial preservation and consolidation is to be found in the Balkans, which by the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century had transformed into several small independent states. In this period, the maps within people's minds, so-called mental maps, the basic cultural coordinates by which they lived, changed slowly, usually due to state intervention, disruption by war, and also through the extended literacy and print culture. Taking the example of Italy, in the famous words of Italian statesman Massimo d'Azeglio, once Italy was made, the only thing remaining was to make the Italians. The boundaries of the new nation-state did not yet correspond to the mental maps and borders within which people in the Italian peninsula lived. A key element in the transformation of the continent during the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution, which went hand in hand with a huge population growth, which set in motion massive waves of emigration, especially to America, but also across Europe as a whole. Thanks to new infrastructure and new possibilities of travel, Europeans became increasingly mobile. Lower transportation costs made it economically possible for many people to cover ever greater distances. Cataclysmic events such as the Irish famine also acted as motors of emigration. In many cases, the people on the move had never before left their villages and were now forced into making a transatlantic voyage in the worst of conditions. They were likely to face generational poverty and become prey to illness, exploitation, discrimination, and deceit. New unions and confederations were created to ease commercial exchanges within Europe. And another consequence of the Industrial Revolution was the increased economic interconnectedness of the continent. Borders remained porous and easy to cross for a long time. Passports did not yet constitute proof of national identity until well into the 19th century. In general, passports remained rather rare and not strictly necessary to travel internationally until around the time of the First World War. However, as borders between states consolidated throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, border checkpoints and controls of documentation and identity became more frequent, starting with the 1870s, when a number of European and non-European governments decided to introduce anti-immigration policies of border control. These were aimed at groups of people deemed undesirable, such as the introduction in Britain of the 1905 Aliens Act against so-called destitute foreigners. In the words of the writer Matt Carr, this spelled the beginning of a bordered world based on so-called paper walls. Over the course of the 20th century, the changes within European borders were significant. In fact, there were 3 major waves of border changes, each tied to the settlement of a war. In 1918-19, at the end of the First World War, in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, and in the period between 1989 and 1991, following the end of the Cold War. The First World War led to the disintegration of land empires within Europe and the creation of new nation-states from their former domains. For populations that had long felt stifled under the rule of distant powers, the 1918 Versailles Peace Treaty presented an opportunity for national self-determination that would bring similar people together within independent states. For others, especially minorities and the inhabitants of mixed regions such as Silesia or cities like Danzig, now Gdansk in Poland, Trieste, now Trieste in Italy, and Salonika, now Thessaloniki in Greece, new borders could only mean lost rights, dispossession, or forced migration. Conflicts over borders continued between the 2 world wars. Hitler's annexation of Austria and of parts of Czechoslovakia in 1938 were just the prelude of a much larger war in which both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union engaged in large-scale social engineering projects that violently altered the ethnic composition of Europe. In this context, of course, the Nazi systematic killing and displacement of Europe's Jewish population, the Holocaust, is important to mention. By the time of the Second World War, and by the time it ended especially, millions of people had been murdered, deported, or displaced. After the Allies defeated the Axis powers, they drafted a blueprint for the post-war settlement at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, which rearranged the continent's internal borders. The Allies' plans quickly became a rigid reality as conflict between the USSR and the USA led to the indefinite postponement of a final peace treaty. In occupied Germany, the Western and Soviet occupation zones became separate states, East and West Germany, that competed against one another for nearly 40 years. During the Cold War era, few European borders changed substantially, but in 1989, the unexpected collapse of the Soviet Union called into question both the placement and the meaning of borders across Europe. This was followed by several momentous changes. East and West Germany united, the Czech Republic and Slovakia separated, the Soviet Union dissolved, and Yugoslavia disintegrated. Thereafter, large parts of Europe became more closely integrated within the structure of the European Union. Today's EU was originally founded in 1957 as the European Communities by 6 member states. It gradually expanded, and it did so in 4 key stages. First, with the so-called Northern Enlargement, through which Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom became members. Second, with the Mediterranean Enlargement, which added Greece in 1981 and Portugal and Spain in 1986, therefore marking an important milestone in this country's transition from dictatorship to democracy. Third, with the accession of Austria, Finland, and Sweden, all countries that had pursued a policy of neutrality during the Cold War, to the renamed and reconstructed European Union, created by the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. And the long Fourth Eastern Enlargement that brought in 10 new member states in 2004, and this was followed in 2007 and 2013 by the accession of new members. These changes have not only changed the location of the EU's external borders to the north, south, and the east, also, of course, with Brexit, but they also affected how the internal borders work. A milestone in this regard was the signing of the Schengen Agreement in 1985. The agreement aimed to abolish checks at shared borders and create a single external border. It entered into force in 1995, gradually expanding to encompass most, but not all, EU states and some non-EU members, promising the free movement of some 400 million people within the so-called Schengen area. The process of EU integration has undeniably reduced barriers to trade and individual mobility between European states, but the practice has also not always lived up to loftier expectations. EU states have suspended Schengen and reintroduced temporary border controls, for example in advance of international summits or in response to terrorism, but sometimes also for extended periods they closed their borders to refugees seeking asylum from civil wars in Northern Africa and the Middle East, a practice that made critics speak of a fortress Europe. The history of Europe's internal and external borders is therefore also the history of their simultaneous, inclusive and exclusive meanings, which continue to evolve to these days. Borders are much more than just a line of division and a tool of territorialization. Some scholars have drawn attention to the prominence and even agency of borders in structuring identities or inspiring artistic representations. Others have looked at borders as contact zones and spheres of cultural exchange, and borders and borderlands can be viewed as landscapes that in many respects are central spaces of social and political dynamics rather than just peripheries. The Czech-German border illustrates some of these points. Since it is partly formed by mountain ranges, its location has been stable and enduring, but its roles have changed several times. Prior to 1938, it was a state border between Germany and Austria-Hungary. More significant, though, often, was the language border or ethnic boundary that went further inland and which helped to define the so-called borderland, a vast peripheral area that was largely coterminous with German-speaking territories. Between 1938 and 1945, the ethnic boundary became the state border after the signing of the Munich Agreement, which permitted German annexation of the Sudetenland of Western Czechoslovakia. From 1945 to 1948, the state border was restored, but the ethnic boundary was removed following the expulsion of the German population. As a result, the borderland acquired new meaning as a territory to be resettled and cultivated anew. After 1948, that part of the state border, which was shared with West Germany, became part of the Iron Curtain that separating the two competing blocs and the two competing socioeconomic systems. The borderland, in the narrow sense of a border zone, turned into a heavily guarded and militarized area. After 1989, the opening of the Czech-German border proceeded in parallel with a general change in internal borders in Europe, culminating in the Schengen regime. Perhaps more importantly, though, the border finally lost its long-cultivated meaning of an identity-reproducing frontier against the major national enemy. No wonder, then, that the border was a strong theme for artistic representations, ranging from poetry to novels and short stories. Many Europeans in the 20th century often paid a high price for passing, crossing, or knocking down borders. They were equally aware of the cost of the new, painful allegiances that were involved in cases of changes of territory. Several cities, such as Berlin, Trieste, Strasbourg, and Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, and Dansk, symbolize the centrality of the border issues within European history. Hence, borders, and above all those that cut and divide, have been invoked in several cultural productions in the 20th century. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, was for a long time the symbol of inhumanity and oppression par excellence. Conversely, its fall amid scenes of rejoicing in November 1989 has allowed it to serve as an icon of passage and a symbol of overcoming arbitrary borders, and the green belt that runs along the former German border and the Berlin Wall Trail for pedestrians and cyclists are very interesting example in this case. Regarding the different modes of presence of past borders, the concept of phantom borders is helpful. The term describes former territorial demarcations that seem to re-emerge after periods of disappearance, or at least keep structuring spaces despite their removal as a result of territorial shifts. The abolished borders of empires, Habsburg, Ottoman, and German, but also of the Soviet Union and of the border-divided Germany from 1949 to 1989, continue to have a long-lasting effect. European borders have generated diametrically opposite responses, from demands for their abolition to measures to reinforce them drastically. In his Plea pour l'Europe, for Europe, the French politician Robert Schuman, one of the architects of the European communities, described one of the aims of European integration as finding a medium position between these two poles. And I quote, "It is not a question of obliterating ethnic and political borders. They are a historical fact, and we do not presume to correct history. What we want is to remove the rigidity from borders, what I would call their intransigent hostility." Borders and boundaries remain, as French historian Nordman has written, a paradox in space. Borders can be both a front line and a place of encounter, a barrier and a pathway, and the history of Europe demonstrates this only too well.